Fire off a couple of shots, that'll get there.
I was thinking about that. You know, I do have a cannon I could have brought up here.
Oh, yeah.
We had the cops here for a cannon 1 4th of July already. I don't
Really? I don't know. I just fired that thing.
Susan, they want everybody to sit down. Hello, everybody.
There you go, Howard. Start waving your crutches around.
Start waving your crutches around.
Quick, somebody get thrown in the pool.
Okay, since you wanted to throw everybody.
Can't even hear that. There we go. Now you can talk. From the diaphragm. From the diaphragm.
There's one more chair. Fran wants to come up here. Fran, do you want to sit over here and talk?
Hello, everybody.
Come on, Kendall.
Everybody,
Down a little bit less.
take a seat or get where you can hear or something. And get Mrs. Oh, there is Mrs. Polisa. Hi, babe. We got her out here.
Bucky's in the pool.
Grandma.
I'm Howard Dickinson, and I'm just married to Dawn, who's one of the daughters of Babe Polisa over here. And I have known Lee Hart here for a long, long time. I knew him as a good cop. He was one of the best cops that Napa City ever had. And knowing him all those years, I didn't know some things about him that I've just learned recently. I knew he'd been doing some of the Yount routines around. I started reading those the last 3 years. But talking with Jane Dwyer Smith, my old Napa High friend, recently, she said that he is known as the godfather of the Yountville Cemetery. He is the president of the nonprofit corporation or company, the cemetery, and runs the thing, collects money for it. It's not a taxable entity at all, and been doing all these things for 30-some years. Also, his parents are buried there, and grandparents who were founders of the valley are buried there also. And I suppose he will, and I will one of these days.
Exactly. It's actually great-grandparents.
Yeah, great-grandparents. Right. And also, I think he was the president of the County Historical Society at one time. Very active with it, and very active. He was one of the founders of the George C. Yount Mountain Men, and he always plays Yount. So I've been wanting to get him over here at some time while Babe Polisa is still around, so that we could have him do his show, do his little thing here on the site of Yount's first adobe first house and the first vineyard in the Napa Valley right here. So now here's Lee Hart. You take her on, Lee.
Actually, I'm not Lee Hart, I'm George Yount. Reincarnated, so to speak. At any rate, I was approached by Howard about 1.5 years ago to come talk about George Yount in front of a small family gathering. And here I am. At any rate, as George Yount, I'd like to welcome everyone to Camus Rancho. You are sitting on Camus Rancho land that I received as a Mexican land grant in 1836, some 11,814 acres. A little history about the Yount family. The Younts actually lived in the Alsace-Lorraine area, and my great-grandparents decided to immigrate to America and brought my grandfather here, who was 7 years old, in the year 1721 on the ship Britannia. They landed in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and my great-grandparents started a farm in that area. My grandfather was raised and married and decided to move to new country. And my grandfather moved to North Carolina, where my father was born. My father's name was Jacob. And during the Great Rebellion in 1776, for a period of time, my father Jacob fought with General Nathaniel Greene against those redcoats. Fortunately for all of us, they were victorious. And then my father returned to a farming life in North Carolina. Unfortunately, a lot of the farms had been burnt and animals had been destroyed during this period of rebellion. I was one of 12 children, and when the youngest was born, my father decided it was time for the family to move on. So I was 10 years old. My parents and brothers and sisters were all loaded into wagons and rolled across the Appalachian Mountains. The year was 1804. I was one of the first families, American families, to settle in the area known as Missouri on the west banks of the Mississippi River. It was a very primitive area. The Osage Indian tribes dominated that area, as well as the Blackhawks. It was very serious farming in those days. In order for the farmers to live through reaping the crops, they had to post armed guards on the corners of the fields to protect the farmers. But everybody survived anyway. Well, it seems that the Redcoats weren't finished with the Americans after the big rebellion in '76, because they plotted to come back and take this land back in 1812. And what they did is they had a two-fronted attack on America at that time. The British were going to attack by sea, and they're going to attack the coastal towns of Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. For several years, the British spies have been infiltrating the Indian territories in the Ohio Valley and had promised wealth to the Black Hawk Indians for massacring American settlers in the Ohio Valley through Kentucky and Missouri. So at the same time that the British attacked us in Washington, D.C., and then fortunately were stopped at Fort McHenry, the Indians were slaughtering settlers in the Ohio Valley through Kentucky and Missouri. So I joined the militia in Missouri in 1813 and went off and fought under Daniel Boone's two sons, who were the commanders of our militia unit. And we fought the Black Hawk Indians for almost 2 years. I became a lieutenant in the militia. And then when we were victorious in that engagement, then I went back to farming in Missouri. So I bought a farm, was doing quite well, raising crops, and I met a woman by the name of Eliza Wilds, and her family was from Kentucky, and they had sufficient amount of funds to take care of themselves and other people as well. At any rate, I had a major problem with Eliza's father. You see, being born in the mountains in the frontier, I never went to school. I was highly trained in how to survive in the wilderness and the frontier, but didn't work well with books. So Eliza's father held that against me. But nevertheless, Eliza and I were married, and she moved on to the farm, and we did really well. I had a son by the name of Robert, and 2 years later had a daughter by the name of Frances. About this time, there was a series of droughts went through Missouri, and the farms dried up, including mine. Fortunately for me, I'd been saving money all this time, and I had accumulated $1,000, but there weren't any banks in the area, so just to make sure that my money was safe, I left my money in the hands of a friend who had a wealthy farm in the area of mine. Well, I became a little bit serious about the decline in the farming industry, So I contacted my friend and said, I need my $1,000 back so that I can buy seed for next year and a new mule. And my friend said, well, I'm really sorry, but I've had hard times too. And your $1,000 is gone. So I talked to Eliza's father and about a loan. And he wasn't interested in helping me. So I looked around for work, and we had what was left of the farm, and the 2 children, and Eliza was expecting a child, and I needed some kind of money to keep the farm going. So I found that there was a trading company heading to Santa Fe, New Mexico from Independence, Missouri, and they needed teamsters. So I signed on as a teamster on this wagon train carrying trade goods from Independence, Missouri down to Santa Fe and Taos, New Mexico. It was operated by a fellow by the name of Hickman and his friend by the name of LeMay. And we had over 100 wagons loaded with trade goods to head down there. And the idea was when we got to Santa Fe and Independence, they're going to sell the trade goods and then I would be paid for my work as a teamster. This is 900 miles through 5 nations of hostile Indians. It was not an easy trip. We had by the way, as a little side story, we had a 16-year-old boy that was hiding out as a stowaway on our trading caravan. It seems that he was sent off to a saddle maker to learn a trade, and he really did not like where he was living, and so he took off and he snuck onto this trading caravan and went with us to Santa Fe, and his name was Kit Carson. At any rate, we got to Santa Fe, and in 1826. Now, you got to understand that in 1822, Mexico gained its independence. Prior to 1822, any American that was caught trading goods or trapping in Mexican territory was sentenced to prison for 25 years. So up until 1822, it was kind of hard on an American to go down and trade in those days. In 1822, Mexico gained its independence, and all of a sudden the doors were open for American trade. So the first caravan started going down there in 1822. We got there in 1826, and of course everything was on the barter system, where we were trading manufactured products, knives, guns, mechanical devices in exchange for blankets and jewelry and other items. But it seems when we got there in 1826 that these other caravans had traded away everything that was left to trade. So we got there and there was nothing left. So we were there with our original caravan of trade goods, nothing to trade for, and we were stuck. Well, I met a fellow at that point by the name of Yount, and Yount was living out of Taos, and he was hanging out with about 25 American trappers out of Taos that were trapping beaver up in the Colorados. So I went out with them the next year thinking if I got a little money trapping beaver, I might be able to make enough money to go back and get my farm back. But we went out in the mountains, and you understand about trapping beaver? You trap beaver anytime you get in the water when it's not frozen over. So you trap beaver in the spring as soon as you get a little thaw in the water so you can set your traps. Then you trap throughout the summer, you trap into the fall and into the winter, and you stay in that frozen water setting traps until the streams freeze over. Well, when the streams froze over, we had a tremendous cache of beaver and otter skins, and very proudly rode back into Santa Fe, New Mexico with our fortune in skins. We didn't realize, though, that Mexico decided to change governors in the New Mexico province. So they had a fellow by the name of Armio, who's now the governor, and he decided he didn't like American trappers. So we rode into Santa Fe and found ourselves immediately surrounded by Mexican troops who declared our trapping illegal and confiscated all our furs. So it's another year's worth of work gone to nothing.
Looks like this is going to take a while.
It might take a while. But at any rate, the next year we went out trapping and we were a little smarter. and we spent the year trapping, and we cached our furs way back in the mountains, and then we smuggled them into Bent's Fort on the Arkansas River. I spent 5 years in this lifestyle, living with the Indians, the Zunis mainly, and trapping with American trappers, riding horseback all the way from Chihuahua, Mexico, up into Idaho. In 1831, I found out that California existed, and I got all these incredible reports about California. So I led 25 mountain men to California in 1831. Came into San Bernardino, went down to an area called the Channel Islands. Found out that they had sea otter down there. So went down and hunted sea otter for a year. Made pretty good money doing that. Oh, back up a little bit. When I was in Santa Fe, the only news you ever got about America was once in a while you'd have a trading company go by or some mountain men to come by, and they'd have a newspaper from maybe 6 months old from back in Missouri with the latest news. Well, my friend was reading the newspaper because I already told you that my schooling wasn't very good. And he goes, "Your name's George Yount." And I said, "Yes, it is." And he goes, "Well, you're in the paper." "Well, how am I in the paper?" He says, "Well, you're in the paper because your wife divorced you." So I guess she figured that I'd been killed by grizzly bears or Indians or something. Anyway, she decided that she was tired of waiting for me to come back. She filed for divorce. So I was down in Southern California trapping these beaver, and the Mexicans down there really didn't like to have a lot of armed Americans around, so they wanted us to move out. In fact, Jed Smith had been there a few years earlier, and they locked up Jed Smith and his party. And so anyway, they said go north. El Norte, go north. So I rode from Santa Barbara up to Monterey and met a fellow by the name of Thomas Larkin. Thomas Larkin was the ambassador to California, to Alta California from the United States. Also met a fellow by the name of Guy Fling, who was a gunsmith there. Guy Fling told me about this town called Yerba Buena down here on the other side of the bay. So I said, well, we're supposed to go north, let's go. So he guided me up to Yerba Buena, which there was nothing there but sand, hills, and a few huts, a presidio and a mission. So he was telling me about this fellow Vallejo, General Vallejo, who was built this fort up here north of the bay to cut off the Russians coming in here, and thought maybe I could get a job up there. So we came around the East Bay, came on up to this Carquinez Straits down here, and so we had to get across the Carquinez Straits. So Guy Fling, he says, hey, it's not a problem. So we walked our horses into the water and swam our horses across the Carquinez Straits. Got on up, came on up through the lower end of the Napa Valley down to Salskull and across the natural stone crossing there, gravel crossing in the bottom, and went on over to Sonoma and met General Vallejo. Well, he said he could use a fellow like me, and I'd had quite a bit of experience in the mountains and the wilds, and it was a pretty wild country in those days. So I did quite a few different things for General Vallejo. And one of them was he had some Indians that were up around the Russian River area that liked to come down and attack his vaqueros and steal cows and what have you. So he had to keep pushing them back. So I rode with him a couple of times, riding up there trying to give his vaqueros a little room. I also took care of the missions when General Vallejo and the Padres were gone. And I being in the wilderness and learning how to build a Kentucky block house, I knew how to split shingles, just like on this roof. Well, they'd never seen a split shingle in California. All the roofs are made out of thatch and mud tiles. So I explained to the General Vallejo about these shingle roofs, and he was in the process of building his adobe in Petaluma at that time. So he hired me. I say hired because hired is kind of a loose term because there wasn't any money in California. All right. So payment was questionable. Anyway, I was employed by General Vallejo to split shingles and shingle the adobe in Petaluma, and then they built the mission in San Rafael, and we put the roof on that also. So I did quite a few things for General Vallejo over a period of about 3 years. Well, the General felt kind of obligated to me for things I'd done for him, and in those days it was strictly barter system. General Vallejo, about all he had was cows, and the cows were used as a form of barter, and they'd go out and slaughter 5,000 cows, for their hides and the tallow. And then the shipping vessels, the big schooner ships, would come out of Boston, come around South America, head to Sandwich Islands, trade there, go up to Alaska, trade with the Russians, then come down the coast and trade with the local rancheros. So they would take these big cases of cowhides and barrels full of tallow and trade them with the merchants from Boston for trade goods. But there wasn't any money involved. It was just trading one object for another. So there was no way that I would be paid for what I'd done working for General Vallejo. But he said, I'll tell you what, we have one thing in this area, and that's land. And I'll sponsor you for a land grant. So I said, okay, I'll do that. But I just want a farm. You know, I don't want a big place, just a farm. So I said, can I get a half a league? And he goes, no, you can't get a half a league. He says the minimum size is 4 leagues. So I don't need 4 leagues. We need land he left over for other people to come in. Let them have the land. You know, all I want is a piece for myself. So we argued back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, and finally General Vallejo said, I'm going to be too embarrassed to even submit a petition for a land grant to Mexico City unless it's at least 2 leagues. So I finally relented and gave in, and he submitted the petition to Mexico City for 2 leagues of land here in the Napa Valley. So in 1836, I got my land grant, Camus Rancho, on the property where we're sitting right now, as my land grant, my first land grant. And again, as I mentioned before, that was approximately 11,814 acres, which ran from about a mile south of here to about 3 miles north of here, from halfway up the side of the hills on both sides and everything in between. There was a group of Indians here called the Camus Indian tribes that I got along with very, very well. So I rode into this valley in 1836 as the very first settler in this valley, other than the original Indians that were living here. And it was quite different then. The primary objects grown in the valley were wild oats, and wild oats would grow as high as a horse's head. Also, they had oak trees, a few scattered around, mainly these wild oats. Problem is they had grizzly living here in the valley also. They like to go out and sleep in the wild oats. So we'd be on horseback and be riding through the valley on horseback, and all of a sudden this old grizz would stand up right in front of us. You know, got to be a problem. So I had to deal with these grizzlies, and that became a nuisance. But I managed to survive that. And then the local Indians in the valley were pretty friendly, but they had this group of Indians up here on the other side of that ridge, place called they call it Howell Mountain now in Pope Valley. And this group of wild Indians came in there, and they'd been attacking the local valley Indians for years, you know, stealing whatever they could steal. Well, then they found out that I'm here and I got cows. Well, you know, I became a pretty prime target. So they had these Indians come over to the mountain from Pope Valley and come in and raid my fort, which I had built right over here. This fort I built was Kentucky style, and it was 2 stories. And the bottom floor was 20 foot by 20 foot, and the top floor was 22 foot by 22 foot, made out of log with a shake roof on it. And I had holes cut in the floor on the outside of the second floor, so that when I was attacked by these Indians from Pope Valley, I could shoot through the holes and protect myself. Also, I got as many of the Camus Indians inside my fort to protect them as I possibly could, because if they were left out there, these Indians from up here might kill them too, or try to. Anyway, they were run by a Chief Hota, was the name of the chief of the Indians that came over from Howell Mountain, and we had quite a few battles back and forth. At any rate, eventually General Vallejo got real tired of riding over from Sonoma to try to rescue me from these attacks by Chief Hota, and he sent a bunch of troops. So I rode with him and a bunch of troops up to Pope Valley, and we settled it out with Chief Hota and his guys. I had my horse shot out from under me and my hat shot off my head, but kept my skin a piece. So it was, I've survived that. That was good. And Chief Hota was pretty well taken care of at that point. Strangely enough, in 1839, I got my second land grant, which was up on top of Howell Mountain, which was 1 league of land, which is about 4,400 acres. and we named it after the old rascal chief, Hota. It was called Rancho La Jota. And it was timber country to provide timber for construction here in the valley. So about this time, the very first wagon train ever to come to California was coming out of Independence, Missouri. And there have been several wagon trains that had come across the prairies and gone to Oregon, but never had anybody come to California. So this group had gotten a letter from a fellow by the name of Dr. Marsh, who had a rancho down by Mount Diablo, and he talked about all the great things in California. And all these people got this letter, and they passed it around, and they all got excited, and they all decided they wanted to come to California. So this was in the fall. So they signed on over 700 people to come to California. Well, by the time the spring came around, the ground dried up enough so you could get a wagon over it. Most of them had second thoughts and decided to quit the project. So we left Independence, Missouri, and there were 69 people in our little group, wagon train, heading across the prairies, coming to California, led by a fellow by the name of Bartleson and another fellow by the name of Bidwell. And they came across the plains. They had no idea where they were going. They had no guide. They had no idea where the water was or the food for the animals or anything. But they stumbled across a group of Jesuit priests led by a Father DeSmet that was heading for Flathead Country in Montana, led by Thomas Fitzpatrick as their guide. He was an old mountain man, friend of mine. I had no idea that they were coming out, and turns out that two of the fellows on this trip out here were neighbors of mine back in Missouri. Of course, they thought I was dead too. So at any rate, they got as far as Fort Hall, Idaho, and 30 of them decided that they'd had enough of that, and they could see the wagon ruts going to Oregon. So they went to Oregon. So it turned out to be 39 people came across in the first wagon train to California, made it as far as down here at Carson Sink. Couldn't get over the mountains, had to leave their wagons there, and walked across the Sierra Nevada mountains came out over by Dr. Marsh's place in Mount Diablo. Two of those fellows, one of them was named Joseph Childs, and the other was Charlie Hopper. And they both became famous here later on with their own properties, and Joe Childs particularly got a big land grant up in what's now called Childs Valley. At any rate, they came back and came on over, spent a little while with me, and I wanted to know about my family. What happened to my family, my children? So they said, well, your children are fine, and my wife was expecting when I left in 26. This is now 41. So they said, well, you know, what's my third child? They said, well, it's a daughter by the name of Elizabeth. So I said, well, you guys going to go back? And they said, yeah, we're going to go back and bring our families out. So I said, well, when you go back, ask my family if they want to come out and join me. I got plenty of room. Got 11,000 acres here, you know. So they went on back, and Charlie Hopper stayed for another year, but Joe Childs came back the next year, and my son Robert, he didn't quite understand my absence, and he decided not to come out here. But my two daughters, Frances and Elizabeth, came out the next in 42, and came on out and joined me here on this rancho. A few years later, my son Robert passed away, and his wife Pamela and their little girl, another Elizabeth, came on out and joined me also here on the ranch. My granddaughter actually was raised on my ranch. Her mother went back to Missouri for a trip and passed away back there. And so I raised my granddaughter Elizabeth here on the Camus Rancho, and she eventually married a fellow by the name of Thomas Rutherford. And I gave them a wedding gift of 1,000 acres and built them a home in 1864 on the north end of Camus Rancho. It's amazing to be able to be reunited with my family again after all those years. Eventually, more and more settlers came out. 1846 was a banner year. Put yourself in 1846. In 1846, the Donner Party was trying to come out across the plains. They didn't make it. They had a fellow on that Donner Party by the name of James Reed. And James Reed got into a little bit of an argument with another fellow in that Donner Party, and it went to knives, and James Reed won that argument, but the people in that group, the Donners, didn't appreciate it very much. So they wanted to string him up, and finally they decided to banish him from the group. So James Reed took off from the Donner Party in the middle of the Great Basin area on foot. His family smuggled him a horse and a gun. So he came on out here ahead of the rest of the party, came into California. His wife and children were still with the Donner Party. So he was waiting on all these wagon trains. That was the banner year for the wagon trains coming across the plains, was 1846. So all these different groups are coming across the plains, and James Reed stayed around Sutter's Fort. By the way, Sutter built his fort in 1839, 3 years after I built my fort here just behind us. Lo and behold, his wife and children and the rest of the Donner Party never showed up. So they commenced to get a rescue group going that went out in the dead of winter and managed to rescue the survivors. I financed a good part of that with livestock and men to go help on the rescue and provisions for that rescue party. And then when they came out of that rescue, then they were invited to come here. So the Reed family came and stayed on Camus Rancho for quite a long time after that, recovering from their ordeal of starvation in the mountains. Also in 1846, there was a group of Fremont men that rode into Sonoma and arrested General Vallejo and his brother Salvador and his brother-in-law Jacob Lassie, and hauled them off to Sacramento and locked them up in Sutter's Fort. The only problem with that is that General Vallejo was one of the few Mexican rancheros who was working with Thomas Larkin to try to get Americans into California to have California become a Mexican or an American possession. So they kind of arrested the wrong guy. But at any rate, that went on. So that was in 46. So in 47, we had American military troops in California coming in by ship and also inland with troops to take California. There was a president by the name of James Polk. And James Polk decided that he needed to fill this Destiny Manifesto of James Madison to have America go all the way from the Atlantic to the Pacific. So President Polk actually commissioned troop movements into California and Texas and New Mexico and engaged in some combat there. So in 1847, we had the rescued members of the Donner Party here on Camus Rancho. We had members of the Bear Flag Party in Fremont, many of them living in the upper Napa Valley up towards Calistoga, the Richies and the Starks and others. And they had American troops all over. In fact, Commodore Stockton and his troops were stationed right across the river over here under oak trees, bivouacked over there, waiting for their trip back to Washington to report to President Polk about their conquests here in California. So we had decided it was a good time for a picnic. It was kind of awkward because the Mexican flag was still flying throughout the state. Mexican troops were still in the state. This land was still under Mexican authority. The United States was now in Mexico, marching on Mexico City. It seems that Mexico didn't want to sell California, so our troops were in there negotiating. So, at any rate, I decided it was a good time for a 4th of July picnic. Good old 4th of July, back to '76. So, there was a fellow by the name of Colonel Stephen Cooper and his family come across in 46 in a wagon train, and they were staying here with me. Anybody who wanted to stay on Camus Rancho was welcome. My doors were always open, food was always provided, and you could stay as long as you wanted. And it's the old Mexican tradition of the missions. It had exactly the same policy. At any rate, on the 4th of July in 1847, we had a 4th of July celebration here with an American flag on top of a big cake. And we had about 125 Americans here from all over Northern California to celebrate the very first 4th of July in California. So it was quite a momentous event. One problem is we had this Dr. Bale. Well, Dr. Bale had this land grant north of us, Rancho Carne Humana, with about 20,000 acres, and Dr. Bale was from England. Well, you know, he remembered the rebellion in '76, and he remembered the second attempt in 1812, and he wasn't real happy with Americans, and less happy with the American flag. And he had a little problem with alcohol. So, but he was a neighbor, and I invited him also. So because we were friends, he showed up, and he came to this 4th of July picnic. And fortunately, he drank a little bit too much wine, and he decided that it was his duty as a Britisher to remove the American flag from this cake. Well, my son-in-law, James Vines, grabbed hold of Dr. Bale and wrestled him away from the cake, and they put him on a buggy and took him home. He spent the rest of the day there. But it was a great, great event, and it was a tremendous picnic and a celebration on a day much like today, right here in Camus Rancho. The story goes on and on. California becomes a state. More and more people come into this area and populate it, and it's wonderful that all these Americans came in here. Eventually, in 1865, the year after my granddaughter Elizabeth married Tom Rutherford, I came down with pneumonia, and I went to that great mountain man area in the sky. 71 years of age, unheard of for anybody to live 71 years in these days. You know, most people are lucky to live 30, 35 years. At any rate, in 1865, same year that President Lincoln was assassinated, I went to the great mountain man area in the sky. Born in 1794, the same year that George Washington was president. So that's kind of my life period. And I am now at rest in the Yountville Cemetery over the other side of that knoll. If some of you have never been there, it's well worth a trip, a visit over there. The monument on the gravesite of George Yount is a beautiful piece of work. It was created shortly after his death in 1865, and it was hand engraved. And it's got 4 sides to it depicting George Yount through the periods of his life. At any rate, I really appreciate everybody's attention. I thought everybody would be snoozing by now. And there's lots of other stories, but I think that I'm kind of at my time limit. So anyway, I appreciate your attendance. Thank you very much. Howard Dickinson mentioned that I'd known him for a long time. Actually, I knew him before I went to work for the police department. I worked for a title insurance company.
All right.
I was an escrow officer there. And I got involved with the Yountville Cemetery because my great-grandparents are buried there, and great-aunts and uncles and so forth. And my parents died when I was 24 years old. And consequently, I had them buried in the Yountville Cemetery. And they have a little nonprofit organization that manages the Yountville Cemetery on a shoestring, pretty much. And so I got involved in that in 1965. And I was told all I had to do was go to a meeting once a year, and that was it. Well, within 2 years, everybody on the board either had quit or had died. And so I was 26 years old and decided whether I was going to just walk away from the cemetery or not. And I decided that I couldn't do that. I needed to keep working and keep the cemetery up. But the corporate charter had expired, and there were no bylaws or anything. And so I contacted Dickinson, Peatman, and Fogarty in 1967, and contacted Jim Fogarty. His father, Walter, had been very active with Tula Cay Cemetery, and I figured, well, he must know something about cemeteries. I don't know a thing about cemeteries. All I know is that it's a place of respect. There's incredible history here in the Yountville Cemetery. You know, it's something that is so valuable and so treasured in this area. That cemetery is so incredibly valuable to the richness and the history and the culture of this area that it has to be preserved. So Jim Fogarty drew up a new corporate charter and set of bylaws, and courtesy of Dickinson, Peatman, and Fogarty. I don't know if you knew that, Howard, or not.
Didn't know that.
But I guess you helped pay for it because there was no charge to us. And started the Cemetery Association moving along again. The cemetery actually was part of the Camus Rancho, and where George Yount had Indians buried, and the very first settlers were buried in the Yountville Cemetery way back in the 1830s. At any rate, it was part of the family. When George Yount died, he had a will, and his will said that his estate would be maintained for 5 years. Ranches run, properties maintained, just like he was alive. And in 5 years after his death, everything was going to be auctioned off. And the proceeds from his sale of all his properties would then be divided amongst his heirs. And one of those pieces of property was the Yountville Cemetery. Well, there weren't a lot of people interested in the cemetery. Fortunately, his son-in-law, Eugene Sullivan, decided to save the cemetery. So he bought the cemetery from George Yount's estate in 1871 for $1, and continued in the Yount family, even though George Yount had died. His estate had been sold off. The Yountville Cemetery still continued in the Yount family. And then George Yount's granddaughter decided that in 1896 that she was tired of the cemetery, and there was problems up there with weeds and poison oak and blackberry vines and so forth. And there was a group of people in Yountville that decided that they wanted to do something about preserving that cemetery. So they formed the Yountville Cemetery Association, a volunteer, non-profit group, just to maintain the integrity and the beauty and dignity of the cemetery. And so Margaret Davis sold them the cemetery for $10, and they took over managing the cemetery only for maintenance purposes. So since 1896, there's been a Yountville Cemetery Association from time to time. There have been times of 10, 15 years where nobody was interested, and the cemetery went back to blackberry bushes and poison oak, and then another group of people would come along and say, well, we're interested in working in the cemetery as volunteers. We'll call ourselves the Yountville Cemetery Association. And they keep the cemetery going for another 15 or 20 years. And then another generation would come by and they weren't interested. Fortunately for me, I guess, I don't know, it's been a lot of work for 35 years, but fortunately for me, in 1965, when I buried my parents in the cemetery, it was right at the end of one of those periods of 20 years of care for the cemetery. And that's everybody on the cemetery board were in their 70s and 80s. And so within 2 years, everybody passed away. So I've been able to keep this thing going for another 35 years, since 1965, to keep the cemetery moving along. The cemetery gets no public funds whatsoever. It's owned by this nonprofit organization known as the Yountville Cemetery Association. I have a small group of supporters for the cemetery that donate a little money each year to help pay for the cleanup and the weed spray and that sort of thing, and maintain that piece of ground as it should be maintained. At any rate, everybody's glass is empty, and I've talked enough, so thank you very much.
Of George Yount, and in a capsule form so you can get it all without 2 books or something. That's wonderful. There are some people I'd like to introduce here. One is Tony Porterfield, who is a great, I don't know how many greats, granddaughter of George Calvert Yount. Would you stand up, please, Tony? And he's a friend of